Hi, welcome to Tim's Antique Trains. Today we are at my upstairs workbench taking a look at a steam engine made by Pocher. This engine was made in 1968 by Pocher in Italy. Alright, let's take a look at this engine. This engine actually is old enough that it features a lot of brass pieces. So we'll start at the front. We've got our plastic cowcatcher with non-operating plastic knuckle coupler, a brass uncoupling wire, brass handrails, a brass mount for the headlight. The headlight is plastic, but the front of the headlight is brass also. The headlight on this engine operates. We'll get to that, how it works in a little while. Brass top and bottom of the smokestack, a brass bell, brass sand and steam domes, brass wire to operate the steam dome, brass pistons, although these are actually solid blocks of brass that are machined. The side rods do not actually go into the pistons like a lot of other locomotives do. Let's see, there's brass wire handrails, brass wire sand tubes that would put sand onto the tracks for gripping the tracks in wet and rainy conditions. Oh, another thing up here, these have brass flag holders down here, one on each side. Move toward the back of the engine. Red molded plastic cab. More brass decorative pieces here. Plastic wheels with metal flanges. The locomotive actually has very deep flanges. We'll get to that in a little bit when I compare this to a newer version of this engine. Let's move along to the tender. It's the Virginia and Truckee line. This is a oil burner locomotive, so it's got an oil tank plus a water tank instead of a wood load like some of the other variants would have. That means this engine doesn't have a spark arrestor on the top of the smokestack. It's just a straight stack. This engine has the motor in the tender. You can see it on the bottom. It's exposed on this engine. Now, this engine uses 8 wheels for pickup. So four of the wheels on the tender are pickup on this side, and 4 of them are insulated on that side. The opposite is the case on the locomotive. So these 4 wheels are pickup wheels, and these are insulated. So this engine has the motor in the tender. When I got this engine, it did not have a drive shaft, but I was able to find a replacement on eBay. It uses a hexagonal drive, and I have a duplicate here, so you can see what the drive shafts for this look like. They're hexagonal shaped, which means they're a little noisy, but they work just fine. And these are 3D printed. A guy on eBay is selling these. I like the clear. It's slightly blue tinted, but it's nice that it's clear so that you can't see it as much on the when it's running around. It kind of disappears. Let's move along to the back of the tender, and there's a couple things that are not quite right on this one. One is that there is no coupler, and that is because the original had a very unusual hook type coupler that is not compatible with any of the other trains. The mechanism for that sat way underneath the tender frame, whereas the coupler should be much higher. It would actually have to be inside the frame here. So right now I do not have a coupler, and then one of the steps is broken off. I'll have to glue that back together at some point. So this has some rope decorations molded into the tender, and the engine number 11, and also the toolbox. Go on to the other side and continue the tour back up toward the front. The wiring for this locomotive is rather interesting. 4 of the wheels in the tender go right to the motor. So, and then the front wire, the front wheels picked up and actually transmitted their electricity through the frame, through a metal post, and then through the drawbar to another metal post in the tender, where the wire picked it up and sent it to the motor from there. Worked pretty good, actually. There are also contacts hiding underneath here for the drive wheels, and then the front truck picks up through a spring contact, and then it travels through the whole frame as well. This engine has a brass drive gear. Let's see. This one also features a air compressor. I'm going to finish up by looking at the front boiler. Now the boiler, this engine was very dirty when I got it. It was missing, like I said, the drive shaft, and the front boiler was also very tarnished and dirty. I ended up repainting the front boiler door in its original chrome color. It looks much better now. So the headlight originally only had one wire going to it because it was intended to have one wire coming from the tender pickup, and then the other wire for the headlight would come through the frame of the engine. So it would actually go from the pickup wheels through the metal plate, through the screw, through the whole engine into the brass parts of the smokestack, and that's how it would conduct the electricity to the headlight. In theory, that works fine. In practice, it never lit up the headlight. So I ended up adding a secondary wire to transmit the electricity directly from the two contacts on the motor, as one of the wires already was. So the black wire is the original, and that one could be disconnected. But the orange wire I added because it makes the headlight operate much more reliably. So that is the 1968 Pocher version of this engine. Now I'm going to also compare this to a much newer Riverossi variant of the exact same engine. Alright, so we're going to take a look at the much newer Riverossi variant of this engine. Now this engine is much newer. It has a lot fewer components to it and much less brass. It's much more plastic. So no front coupler right away. Now this is a slightly different model design of a locomotive, but the castings and the moldings are almost identical, and these are 40 or 50 years apart between the two engines. So we'll start at the front again and tour around this locomotive. Now this is a wood burner, so it has a spark arrestor built into the top of the smokestack. Alright, plastic cow catcher, brass flag holders on the front of the engine. It has brass handrails that go back along the boiler. And that's about it for the brass on this engine. The headlight holder is also brass that holds it in place to the smokestack. This engine features a non-operational headlight with a oil light style headlamp. So this engine does not have brass pistons. These are plastic, painted gold to match the older version's brass. Almost identical, if not identical, drive mechanism. Again, plastic decorative pieces underneath here. Brass, metal, wire, sand tubes. Molded plastic pieces down here that the original engine has are brass. You can barely see it, it's painted black. Plastic on the top of this engine as well. Plastic bell, plastic sand dome, and plastic steam dome painted brass. It does have a brass operating wire for the steam dome. The shell and boiler of these two locomotives are virtually identical, being almost 50 years different. The only difference is the colors they were painted. And then this one has a slightly different window design than the older engine. Of course, it is representing a different type of locomotive between the two, but the shells, the castings are almost identical. As we toured the older version of this engine, it has much larger flanges on the wheels. You can see that the wheel flanges on the older engine are very, very deep. And a lot of people on the internet have complained about it derailing on more fine scale track. Now, I operate code 100 track, so that is not an issue for me operating either of these locomotives. But it could be for some. Now, this newer version has the wheel flanges much shallower to accommodate for different types of track. The wheels are also blackened for a more realistic appearance. Same or very similar plastic red wheels. Identical drive system. The only difference being underneath a new motor. Now I'm not going to open the motor up to compare them, but this one has a sealed bottom so you can't see the motor in this one. But the wheel pickups are identical. Again, it transmits the electricity the exact same way between the two through the drawbar and into the tender for the motor. This one also has a newer style drive shaft. It's a little thinner, but it uses a more modern style drive shaft. It's much quieter. This one does not have, the newer one does not have an operational headlight, so no wires running from the tender to the cab. Moving along the back, this one features a K-horn style coupler, which is pretty standard now for engines like this. Even though it's not prototypical, it works, and that's what's important. So this one is actually molded right into the frame of the locomotive, so it's the correct height. If I were to have that on the old one, I would have to cut away a portion of the frame for the coupler to fit in there properly and be at the correct height to pull a train. Alright, I think it's time we take these two engines down to the track and run them.